Forget. Okay, so we're now recording. So at the close of Tuesday's class, we were continuing our account of the development of the so-called British empiricist tradition that was arguably inaugurated by the sort of rationalist metaphysics and epistemology of René Descartes from the 17th century. We're already somewhat familiar with that. So we worked through Descartes' implicit critique from the third meditation, which of course we didn't read, but I shared with you a passage from that. So we worked through Descartes' implicit critique of what we called naive realism, and then we saw how that motivated a view labeled representational realism or representationalism, usually exemplified by John Locke. So we talked a little bit about John Locke again, and then we saw some skeptical problems that were exposed from that particular approach that gave rise to a position within metaphysics that we call idealism. And so the first major proponent of that tradition was George Berkeley from Ireland. So he's a part of this kind of British empiricist tradition. And so let's return to those slides real quick. All right, so for those, I know there are a couple of you, or at least Renee wasn't here for Tuesday, but can someone explain, well, we can just go through this really quickly so that we're all on the same page. So why is it, for somebody who is here and has a good, at least you think you have some confidence about what we've discussed, why did certain philosophers, for example, Descartes and Locke, see a problem with this common sense understanding of the world that we called naive realism? So what was the problem with this view? We'll just run through these positions again very quickly so that we all understand where we are. So can anyone bring us back to this part of our conversation Tuesday and explain, first of all, what naive realism is and what problem there was with it, according to certain philosophers?
Yeah, so wasn't the problem that like you could perceive something as not what it actually is?
Yeah, so you're saying that we can perceive, it's a possibility, it's a possible sort of experience such that we can fall into error, that our judgments about the world can be erroneous. That is, we can be wrong, we can be mistaken about our perception, that is, how we grasp objects to be, or in a deeper sense, and this is part of the major implications of Hume's approach, as we'll see, the ideas that we have that are deeply and ineliminably entangled with our originary sensations or perceptions of the world, our ideas can be flawed. And to the extent that those problematic ideas color the very perceptual opening that we have onto the world, we might be thrust into a kind of skepticism, right? But according to naive realism, the problem is such that that possibility isn't even recognized. So if naive realism is correct, then it's impossible to be mistaken about what it is that we perceive and what truths we judge in accordance with our perceptual experience about the nature of the world that we inhabit, including ourselves and our own bodies. But we know from our own experience that we're very frequently wrong about things. So the naive realist who says, there is, first of all, there is a mind-independent reality, which is a view I don't think many of us would object to. So that's okay so far. The naive realist holds, and this is what undergirds metaphysical realism in itself as a fundamental view within the domain of metaphysics, that there is a mind-independent reality. But then the naive realist makes, as Descartes says in the previous slide, this principle and really common error that we judge that the idea that we have in ourselves, that is, when you're looking at the stove and the eggs, when you're preparing breakfast in the morning, you are apprehending what you take to be a material object that you're interacting with. But in fact, Descartes would say you're dealing with a representation of that object and sort of scene made up of various objects standing in relation to one another in the so-called external world or outside world. And we make errors when we say that the idea within my consciousness really does correspond in a direct and perfect way with some objects out there in the world, substances out there in the world. And so this is this sort of inchoate or primitive implicit form of what would later be described or labeled as representationalism or representational realism. So then on the basis of this criticism from Descartes, Locke argues that there aren't really two objects, or excuse me, two elements to every perceptual or experiential encounter. There is, first of all, the subject and perceiver, then the object and perceived, but the relationship between the subject and the object on this view is always mediated by some third term. So that would be the idea or the representation. So the example that Charles provided us last time was he saw what appeared to be an actual organism, so a real tree, a living plant, but upon closer inspection, he realized it was plastic, so it was artificial, it had been manufactured. So that means, according to this view of representational realism, Charles had a mistaken idea or representation as his mediating contact with some phenomenon outside in the world. And then upon closer examination, he was able to adjust and improve the erroneous features of that representation such that a greater approximation or closeness was achieved with respect to 3 and 2, object and representation of object. But then what was the problem with representationalism that motivated Berkeley's idealism? So I think it was Elena last time, if I'm remembering correctly, who gave us a really good answer to this question. But does anyone remember what the problem was?
Wasn't it that, like, if I'm remembering correctly what I said last time, it was like you'll never know whether you can never trust your perceptions. Like you'll never know whether something's actually true or it is true because you'll constantly be questioning what you're seeing.
Perfect. And you have good reason on the basis of this view to question everything that you think you saw or experienced, because according to representationalism or representational realism, one never, no matter how clear and obvious one's immediate perception of the world seems to be, in the most simple of circumstances, one never actually makes direct, immediate contact to the entities that populate that world. So any perception you have, including the one that I have right now, made up of my sensations, of a visual variety, of a tactile variety, of an auditory variety, of an olfactory variety, so my sense of smell, all of these sense modalities, which flesh out and substantiate my knowledge and experience of the world, these all play into my representation of what's going on right now. So I never make direct contact with the world, but that contact is always mediated through some localized subjective idea or representation. And which means that to be sure about the truth of what I take to be reality or what I'm experiencing in the world, I can't ever, I have no freedom with which to do this. I cannot ever take my representation or my idea as we would want to, as would be very helpful and satisfying in our efforts to really achieve knowledge. I can never take my representation or idea and compare it to the objects or the perceived substances out there in reality of which they are ideas or representations. So I can never say, all right, here's my idea representation, here's the outside world and the objects of which I have a representation, that is reality, and I'm going to compare them to see where there's a disconnection, that is to see where my representation falls short. And then I can do whatever I perceive to be needed to achieve a level of adequation between the representation and the object. So I can instead, all I'm able to do is compare my representations to each other because all I ever have available to me in terms of my relationship to the world are representations. So as Eleni was just saying, that leaves us in this really corrosive state of skeptical doubt or skeptical worry, such that we can never be confident that our representations are accurate. And so Locke, remember, John Locke said, well, okay, yeah, you should be a little bit skeptical, but don't worry, because we can deploy science in our effort to attain true legitimate knowledge of the world and its phenomena. So using categories that had implicitly at least already been provided by Descartes in the second meditation, those categories, the differential lines of quality or properties that inhere in every object or every subject-object relation. So remember, there are the primary and secondary qualities. And just as Descartes was very suspicious or skeptical of the truth of those secondary qualities of the ball of wax, like the color which changed when it was brought to the fire, the kind of texture or shape was changed, the possible sounds that would be emitted by the object were altered, the smell, the taste, and so forth. So these are all secondary qualities that are secondary insofar as they are inelimitably caught up or entangled with one's subjective sense modalities. And this is why we experience as different individuals colors differently, smells differently, tastes differently. So some people think, for example, that what is it? I'm thinking of cilantro, that it tastes like soap, right? They can't stand the flavor. But I love cilantro. I can't recognize that. When I eat cilantro, I don't register any kind of comparable flavor of soap. So then my immediate sensation of that, being the secondary quality of taste, this gustatory sense, is entirely different in its qualitative character from what you would experience if you're someone who thinks that it's disgusting, that cilantro is gross because it tastes like soap, right? So then to get to the truth of the cilantro, that is the objective truth of the cilantro, what this material is, we can't take into consideration the flavor, because the flavor that I experience that's different from what you experience tells us really something more about ourselves, about differences between my subjective equipment by which I navigate the world and have sensations, and your subjective equipment. So then we have to appeal to primary qualities, which are not qualitative really, they're essentially quantitative. And those are the standards of measurement, for example, opened up by scientific methodologies. So concepts in terms of units of measure, such as what we find when we're trying to make sense of volume or weight or mass or something like that. So then Locke's idea is we abstract away all of the secondary qualities until we arrive at the primary ones. But Berkeley comes along and says abstraction in that way, separating, distinguishing, teasing apart these so-called primary and secondary qualities is impossible. So I can never remove, for example, if I'm trying to conceive of a triangle, or rather the mathematical concept of triangularity in my consciousness, I can't eliminate anything of the so-called subjective order. I can't get rid of the color, for example. When I conceive of a triangle, I'm going to necessarily conceive of it of a particular shape, of a particular magnitude, and standing forth through the relief of a particular contrasting color pattern, right? So the triangle will maybe be white against a black background in my mind, or perhaps it'll be black against a white background, or red against a green background, or something like that. We can never abstract the so-called subjective qualities. And ultimately, he'll argue, Berkeley will argue, we can never abstract away the very fact of perception when it comes to any sort of experience as the basis for knowledge, given that we're dealing with steps or iterative moments in the progress of British empiricism, right? So we're talking about empiricism. And very quickly, and this is something we've talked about already many times, but who can define empiricism as a kind of epistemology? So what does it mean to say that Locke is an empiricist, Berkeley is an empiricist, and David Hume is an empiricist? And we can say that the nameless narrator in the Horla short story would also be considered an empiricist. So what does that mean? So what is empiricism?
Isn't it like us knowing what it, or like knowing knowledge through like the experience we have?
Mm-hmm. Good. So epistemologists are trying to find ways to, first of all, understand how knowledge is possible. And that entails, of course, some sense of from where it derives, right? So when is it that we attain legitimate knowledge that can be preserved, unpacked in various ways, and communicated to others, versus simply bandying about this or that subjective opinion or groundless belief? Well, according to rationalists like Descartes, it's not through our senses, because remember, looking at that ball of wax example again, everything that our senses seem to determine or arrive at in terms of a belief or an opinion. So this wax is green, this wax tastes like honey, this wax smells like flowers. All of that determinacy has fallen away once the wax is melted. Yet the meditator still knows, that is, still has knowledge that despite those radical changes, it's the same wax ultimately, because it's the same materiality. And how do we do that according to Descartes? Well, through reason, through the rational intellect. But empiricists, on the other hand, like Berkeley and Locke before him, and then Hume after him, argue contrarily, that no, ultimately all knowledge derives on the basis of sense experience. So elsewhere, Hume says, quite provocatively, that the intellect is a slave to the passions. And he's not entirely novel or innovative in that approach, given that he's ultimately advancing an Aristotelian view within metaphysics and epistemology. So this was a kind of criticism that Plato's most famous student, Aristotle, introduced to the world. But really, I should say that Aristotle was simply developing a criticism or a line of critique that Plato himself already opened up with respect to, or pointed at, his previous doctrine, the Platonic forms, which is a kind of proto-rationalism, you might say. So Hume is following a tradition of empiricism that, although we're calling it modern empiricism and a part of this British empiricist tradition, which began in the 17th century, but it really took root and developed in profound ways in the 18th century. Berkeley, and I mentioned how strange he is in terms of locating him within this sort of cross-section of epistemological and metaphysical positions that one can stake out or identify with, given that he is, on the one hand, epistemologically an empiricist, so he thinks, like Locke and Hume, that everything we come to know is ultimately grounded in experience, sense experience. But on the other hand, metaphysically, Berkeley is an idealist, so he rejects realism. That is, he rejects the notion that there is, in fact, some mind-independent reality. So he would say that everything, including the physical world, the earth, the objects that occupy it, and even heaven itself, exist only within the scope or framework of a mind and the ideas that take shape within that kind of space of mind. And so Berkeley then is developing this strange position in critical reaction to the kind of irresolvable skepticism that he saw implicated or a kind of necessary consequence of Locke's approach, Locke's particular empiricism. So Berkeley says we can never really get at the truth of the so-called substance, the thing that exists out there, because we cannot disentangle by appeal to so-called primary qualities, which we can never disentangle or abstract from the very subjective consciousness through which one becomes aware of them, whether they are robustly, richly qualitative, like colors, sounds, smells, and so forth, or quantitative, standards of measurement or attunement, such as what we find in the sciences. And so this is where we find Berkeley's famous statement, esse percipi, to be is to be perceived. So to exist at all, this is an essential metaphysical principle. To exist in any way is to stand forth as the object of some perceptual framing or experience. And so, again, the examples I used were, even if you think of some space where you know there is no human consciousness there present. So like a closet in a bedroom in your house or something, it's closed. There's nobody there to look at it. Surely it's the easiest thing in the world for you to imagine this space existing outside of your perception or experience. But Berkeley would point out that while you're doing that, all you're doing is surreptitiously abstracting your very present consciousness from that scene. And the other example he uses is you're sitting in your office or your classroom at the university, you can look out the window and see like the quad or a field or trees or whatever. And if you're at a different place, you can imagine that very field or space. You can imagine it existing without anyone there to see it or experience it. But again, you're just abstracting your present consciousness of it away from the scene. So ultimately, there has never been any object or substance that we are perceiving or thinking about in our consciousness that can be separated from an act of experience or perception. So for this reason, deploying the principle of Occam's razor, and I wonder if any of you in other contexts have heard of that before, but this particular principle that emerged in the Middle Ages by this philosopher Occam, we can eliminate that other term, that is objects or substances that supposedly exist out there in the world, right? So has anybody heard of Occam's razor before? So you might have heard that used in a science class or something like that.
I heard it in a science fiction book a long, long time ago that I read in like grade school, but I forget what it means.
Okay, anybody else? I can explain it, but maybe someone wants to Google it real quick. And someone can share this idea with us. So Occam's razor, it's OCCAM. You should be able to find a pretty straightforward definition.
I got the definition here if you want me to read
Yeah,
it.
please. Go ahead.
It says the principle that in explaining a thing, no more assumptions should be made than are necessary. This principle is often invoked to defend reductionism or nominalism.
Good, good. So in the event, to put it differently, in the event that in your effort to explain some natural phenomena, there is more than one competing interpretation, you should, all things being equal, prefer the interpretation that makes the least number of assumptions or presuppositions, right? So this is an appeal to explanatory elegance. And that caveat is important, that all things being equal. So it's not just that elegance or simplicity trumps everything. It's just that if you have alternative approaches to explanation, and they both seem to be fairly plausible, but of the two, one has the least number of questionable assumptions at play, well, that's the one that we ought to prefer. So Berkeley's idea here is, well, if we have these three elements, the subject, the object, and the idea or the representation, but we only ever have access to the idea or representation, that is to say, we never confront the substance, as Locke named it, which is supposed to underlie, as an objective state of being, the various properties that we as subjects attune ourselves to and engage with in experience. If we never have access to this spooky substance, this, as even Locke put it, this je ne sais quoi, this I know not what, this reality, supposed reality of which I can't say anything at all, well then why should we even accept that it's there? So by appeal to Occam's razor, we should just get rid of it. And all we have then are minds, that is subjects and ideas within those minds. And so where I left you last time was a question about some of the strange or problematic implications of this philosophy, of this epistemology and metaphysics. So, well, one problem is, and this is what critics were very quick to point out in response to Berkeley back in the 18th century. So then every time I blink my eyes, the so-called objective world disappears, right? It's annihilated because I'm no longer perceiving it, given that perception is the sole necessary condition for the possibility of being. If I cease to perceive something, then it ceased to exist. So the famous cliche or question that is rather cliched, if a tree falls in the forest and no one's there to see it or hear it, does it make a sound? Well, it seems that Berkeley would have to say no, right? Because that sound as the object in terms of its qualitative presence of experience, of perception, can only exist insofar as it's perceived. But that seems to be an incredibly absurd, counterintuitive conclusion, this subjective idealism. But how do you suppose Berkeley would respond to that? So would he necessarily be committed to the absurd conclusion that when, for example, I leave my office at the end of today, it will simply disappear? How do you think he would respond to that? So recall the hint that I left you with. The hint being Berkeley's role as an Anglican bishop. So a priestly character and an important religious order. So what do you suppose, knowing that bit of detail, what do you suppose he would say?
Well, he might come at it with a religious perspective. Like you're saying, he might try to apply his own religion to the problem.
Yeah, and so, well, who's the major character? Who is the supreme player
Well,
in a
God, right?
Right, God. So then how could this sort of role, this divine role, help preserve Berkeley's metaphysics from absurdity, from the absurd conclusion that everything just disappears, not only when we stop looking at it, but even when we blink momentarily?
Would it be that it's still around to him because God put it there?
Well, because God is the universal perceiver. So unlike individual human subjects, God doesn't blink and God doesn't sleep. So God's gaze is forever on the worldly objects, thus preserving what we take in our own ordinary experience to be an objective external world. So when I do leave my office at the end of the day, it won't disappear because God's uninterrupted gaze will continue it, will preserve it. Does that make sense? So this is the kind of objective idealism that Berkeley uses to support or undergird and to save from absurdity his system of subjective idealism. Okay, so does that make sense?
Yes.
So now we can get to Hume though. So we're dealing with empiricists, including Berkeley, right? So despite the radical sort of, you might even say, fantastic metaphysical implications of his approach, he's still an empiricist. And so the empiricist, as we laid bare today, holds most essentially, most simply, that knowledge derives ultimately from sense experience. So whatever object we come to approach with epistemic clarity or confidence, so whatever it is that we can rest assured that we know in some way, ultimately comes to us through the senses. And so Hume is a radical empiricist. So of this British tradition, he represents the radical apotheosis or highest point of its development. So what do you suppose Hume would say in critical response to Berkeley about this move that he makes towards objective idealism, in which God plays a significant role? Any thoughts on that? If everything we know comes from experience, what do you suppose an empiricist like Hume would say? And it's especially important for this question to understand that we're dealing with the kind of debate ultimately between two empiricists. So it's not that we're finding a critique that takes shape between competing theories, that is, competing epistemologies. So Hume and Berkeley would share the same sort of epistemological framework. And so it's really because of that shared starting point that Hume will really, in a strong way, exert a critical kind of response or leverage a critical response to the direction of Berkeley's idealistic thinking here.
Wouldn't he ask probably for like definitive proof of God?
Right, in terms of experience, right? And
Yeah.
for Hume, as we've already seen, but we'll deepen our understanding of this, but we've already examined to some extent Hume's empiricism from our discussion of his approach, his skeptical approach to the notion of personal identity. But remember, and we can really come from the same point of view to understand both lines of critique, that is the criticism of personal identity and perhaps this criticism of Berkeley's objective idealism. So Hume, remember, is skeptical of the very existence of self or personal identity because we never have an immediate impression of self or personal identity. We only have impressions of various conditions of our experience. So similarly, Hume would ask, well, where is the impression of God? So he would challenge Berkeley's empiricism. He would say, you're not being a rigorous, thoroughgoing empiricist, because in order to save your metaphysics, you're appealing to, by definition, an in principle, non-empirical concept. That is the very concept of God, which as a being, conceptually understood, is in part, by definition, withheld from the possibility of sense experience. So then Hume is really pointing out a contradiction in Berkeley. Does that make sense? And so here's where, and we talked about this last time, Berkeley motivates following the path opened up by Descartes and pursued as well by Locke. He motivates Hume's radical empiricism by making Hume, in his reaction to what came before, the first to note an incredibly influential and corruptive difficulty with respect to this concept of idea, which, as we've seen from last week, we've inherited from thousands of years ago, going all the way back to Platonic philosophy, Platonic metaphysics. So we can see how these arguments, these concepts and ideas, these ways of attuning ourselves to reality, insinuate themselves in broad, largely invisible ways into our everyday navigation of the world over the span of generations. And so this problem is, remember, and this was true for Locke, Berkeley, as well as Descartes, idea can mean a kind of memory that I have. It can mean an image that I conjure up in my mind's eye. It can be an immediate sensation or impression, to use Hume's language, that is perception, or it could be a kind of sentiment or a feeling. So in other words, the idea of idea or representation is far too broad. So that's where Hume says, no one would doubt that there is a seriously important distinction to be made between, and this is one example he uses in our reading, between the mere thought of a feeling like anger or love or some other passion that you can experience in some way when you're watching a film, for example, or reading literature, or hearing the story of another person's experience. So if you're watching a film or reading a story or hearing a friend's story of an ordeal that they went through, you might feel, in some sense, the anger that's present in that narrative. Or if you're reading a romantic novel, for example, you might connect in some measure of your lived experience in your conscious act of reading and opening up to this world, the feeling of love, but that feeling is very much different, Hume would say, than the actual lived experience of you being in love in your relation to another person, right? So the one, you might say, simulating in some measure this feeling or experience would be what Hume calls an idea, whereas your real lived immediate sentiment of love or anger is an impression. So that would specifically be an impression of the inward variety rather than an outward perception or sensation, right? So that brings us back to Hume's empiricist epistemology. So we have impressions, which would be the foundation for all experience and thus the foundation for all knowledge. Impressions are divided into the outward, as I just mentioned, so sense, perception, or sensation, and the inward, so sentiments or emotional feeling. And then ideas, so here's the important intervention that Hume makes in his contribution to this debate he's making this important distinction that was never introduced previously between impressions and ideas. So ideas are different, essentially, in kind from impressions, and they stand in relation to impressions as the effects of the cause, or the faint copies of the original models, you might say. So this tracks roughly the distinction that Plato had made thousands of years ago between the idea, the idea, and the eidolon, which is like the image. And it's that word from which we get in English words like idol. So if you're worshiping a false idol, that means you're worshiping a corrupt or deficient or problematic representation or copy of the original divinity. So you can see how these conversations, these debates influence one another and take root and direction in a non-arbitrary way across historical moments. And so then I'm just using this image of like if you were to toss a stone into a lake, where that stone makes immediate contact, breaking the plane of the surface of the water, that's the impression. And then those concentric circles that radiate out from that center and decay until entirely disappearing would be the ideas. And that's why, and we talked about this weeks ago in the first time we were reading and discussing Hume. But that's why when you're far away from some original experience, the memory is harder and harder to retain, and the memory, as it gets less and less vivid, it can be less and less accurate too. And so this is the sense in which we're often unreliable narrators, because our memory is a little bit tricky. And we talked about that in the context of the John Perry dialogue. And so Hume, and this is just to point out the degree to which he's offering us and working within a really radical empiricism. Hume, provocatively in his treatise on human nature, argued that you should go into a library or other places of learning, and you can pick up any book that's purportedly containing some sort of knowledge, one sort of knowledge or another. It can be theological, scientific, whatever, but you can take any book and examine the so-called knowledge in that book, the ideas or the so-called truths presented. And if you cannot trace, at least in principle, the ideas back that are presented as knowledge within this text, if you cannot trace those ideas back to some original sense experience, of course, not necessarily your own, given that this is applicable to history books too, at least someone's original experience. If you cannot trace the idea back to some sense experience, then what you're dealing with is complete nonsense. And he says you should just throw it into the fire and burn it. So this is referred to as this kind of empirically grounded or justified Humean book burning, right? Whatever cannot be traced back to sense experience is bullshit, right? That's usually going to be rhetorically deployed to manipulate you in some form or another. Hence Hume's powerful skepticism, which is very much different from Descartes' skepticism, because Hume isn't working within what we described as methodological skepticism, such that there is some way to escape it, set aside or pointed to at the very beginning as the very purpose or goal of the exercise of being skeptical, which, remember, for Descartes was to find something which is performatively impossible to doubt. That's not Hume's approach. He thinks we're always going to be skeptical, and we ought to remain skeptical. We ought to retain a healthy degree of skepticism. And in that way, he embraces Socrates as kind of his patron saint, right? So in this way, he's interpreting the Socratic wisdom of knowing that you don't know in a skeptical register, such that we should always suspect that since knowledge is of ideas. So whenever we know something, we're dealing with the content of some idea, and that idea and its content had to be derived through one or another sensory pathway. And as sensory beings, we are fallible, right? And so here I'll turn to the first page of the Horla to give our sense of this fallibility. So this is on the very first page where the narrator on May 12th in the reading, because the reading takes place through a series of various journal or diary entries. He says, everything that surrounds us, everything that we see without looking at it, everything that we touch without knowing it, everything that we handle without feeling it, everything that we meet without clearly distinguishing it, has a rapid, surprising, and inexplicable effect upon us and upon our organs, meaning our sense organs, like our eyes, our ears, and so forth. And through them, so through these organs, on our ideas and on our being itself. So what does this tell us? That our degree of sensitivity, the way in which we as creatures, as organisms, are sensitive to the surrounding world, to the environment in which we find ourselves, is strong enough to make us vulnerable to these largely unseen entities in the world, but weak enough to keep us in the dark about it, to keep us ignorant about it. So as I mentioned in my introduction to the Horla reading on Moodle, think about when this was written in 1886. That's 6 years before the discovery of vaccines. And I think Dmitry Ivanovsky, he was, I believe, a Russian researcher in 1892, is really understood historically to be the father of virology. So viruses were discovered. But think about that, and think about the coronavirus that has ravaged our world in obvious ways, but in ways that I think will continue to reverberate for quite some time, keeping a lasting effect on how we navigate the world and understand ourselves. So think about that. This virus, this being that we can't experience in any direct way through this or that determinate sense impression, can wreak havoc on our organism, on our biological systems, and thus on our sociological systems and on our historical reality. So does that make sense? Any questions or comments so far? You guys still with me?
Yeah, no questions though.
Okay, cool. All right. So let's dig deep now into Hume's framework. So just to, for a moment, regain our big picture, what we're moving towards here is the famous problem of induction. It's referred to as the problem of induction, and it has to do with a problem vis-a-vis our basic grasp of cause and effect relationships. So according to, and this is referred to in the literature as Hume's fork, this is the basic picture of Hume's epistemological framework, his empiricism in a nutshell. All the objects of human reason or inquiry fall naturally into two kinds, namely relations of ideas and matters of fact. So I mentioned last week that this week, we spent a lot of time last week talking about truth. This week, we're turning our thematic gaze more directly and sustainedly to that related concept of fact and matters of fact. So we achieved some view of what truth is last time, and now we're going to talk about what a fact is and how that relates to the true. So what Hume is saying here is that, first of all, well, just to put it very simply, insofar as we claim to know something, whatever that is, it has to have arrived, or we have to, I should say, arrived at it, at the truth, because this is something we took away from Socrates from the very beginning. Knowledge, rather than opinion or mere belief, knowledge, qua, that is, as knowledge, is always knowledge of the true. There's no such thing as false knowledge. So insofar as we have knowledge of some true reality, and that knowledge had to have come to us. We have to have arrived at it through one of two pathways, hence the fork. So he's not referring to, like what you eat dinner with at night. It's like a fork in the road where you have two potential paths. So what we know to be true either comes to us through relations of ideas or matters of fact. So if you understand something to be true, you should be able to trace it back, the origin of the knowledge, as either the product of these mechanisms or processes that he describes as relations of ideas or as matters of fact. So, relations of ideas and this is in section 4, beginning on page 11 in our text. He describes both sides of the fork, beginning on page 11. So he says, this is a little after that sentence, that the square of the hypotenuse is equal to the squares of the other two sides expresses a relation between those figures. That 3 times 5 equals half of 30 expresses a relation between those numbers. Propositions of this kind can be discovered purely by thinking, with no need to attend to anything that actually exists anywhere in the universe. The truths that Euclid demonstrated would still be certain and self-evident, even if there were never a circle or triangle in nature. Right? So remember last time for Plato, when we were talking about various geometric figures like circles, for example. So it became clear that you were able to recognize the attempted form at circularity that I was drawing, even though it fell short. And so he pointed out that ultimately polygons like circles and triangles, and we talked a little about triangles today, are the products not of sense experience, but of intellection. So it's a kind of mathematical concept. So 2 plus 2 equals 4. Right? That's perhaps more straightforwardly obvious, a kind of relation of ideas. Numbers are ideas. So it's not like you can walk down the street and stumble or trip over a 5 or a 23, right? They're not objects that exist as facts that we can experience in one way or another. They express, these numbers, they express relations of ideas which can be populated in terms of their content by material facts. So for example, I can affirm in my experience that 2 plus 2 equals 2 by taking this pen and this pad of paper, that's 2 things, and then taking this lid and my coffee container, that's 2 more things, and saying, okay, 4. 2 plus 2 equals 4 because I have these entities. But the truth of that statement, the truth of the sentence, 2 plus 2 equals 4, is not dependent at all on the material specificity of those 4 objects that I put into a certain relation. I can plug in whatever I want infinitely. There's no end to what I could plug into that formulation. 2 plus 2 equals 4. And so I don't need experience at all to know that 2 plus 2 equals 4, which means no matter where I am or when I am in the universe or in history, 2 plus 2 equals 4, and that is certain. I can know it with 100% certainty. And another way to put that is it's knowable a priori. So this is an important Latin phrase that we've encountered already. So we first saw this word used by Gretchen Weyraub in the John Perry dialogue, and we called attention to it, and we fleshed it out a little bit more in the next week when we talked about Descartes. But what is Who can explain a priori? What is a priori reasoning or an a priori truth? And so that's one of those important vocabulary words that I included in that PDF of important terms from philosophy. So what is a priori?
Isn't it just like deducing something with like common sense or knowledge?
Not necessarily common sense, given that how we usually use that phrase connects to experience in certain ways, right?
Like reasoning or something like that.
Yeah, so a priori, I mean, just the Latin word itself suggests prior, right? So prior to experience, or more accurately, it would be independently of experience. So it's the kind of knowledge I can arrive at any moment without having to rely on this or that particular experience. So the example I just used of 2 + 2 = 4 is one of those. So a priori truths, unlike a posteriori truths, which is the counterpart to that. So if something is knowable a posteriori, then that means it has to be confirmed by appeal to some sensory information which was made available through experience. So for example, the coffee cup is on the table, that sentence. It can be either true or false, right? So right now it's true. I lift it, I take it away, right now it's false, right? So if I want to be sure that it's true, at any moment the coffee cup is on the table, I can't just rely on my mathematical knowledge. I need to use my eyes. I need to use my experience to verify it, right? So that's an example of an a posteriori truth, as a matter of fact. So it is, in other words, a necessary truth that 2 + 2 = 4. It is a contingent truth that the coffee cup is on the table. Contingent meaning dependent on certain material and historical circumstances. So then if I am to verify that the coffee cup is on the table, I will arrive at that truth because, of course, I am the one, or maybe in a different circumstance, it's somebody else who put the coffee cup on the table. But that isn't necessary, right? Someone could have chosen to put the coffee cup on the floor or to not put it anywhere at all. So it's contingent on other facts, such as the presence of people who have coffee cups, use them, and put them places, right? And so relations of ideas are certain, they're knowable, independent of experience a priori, so they are necessarily true no matter when or where they hold, and they are analytically true. And we'll unpack that in just a moment. Matters of fact, on the other hand, are always uncertain because they could always be otherwise. And that's because they're only knowable on the basis of experience, which means they're contingent. That is to say, they're not necessary. The alternative, the contrary, can always be true without contradiction. So it's no contradiction for me to say the coffee cup is not on the table, whereas it is a contradiction for me to say 2 + 2 = 12, right? So then these are the paradigmatic examples of the domains in which relations of ideas on the one side and matters of fact on the other take shape. So there's math, as we already talked about, and then there's deductive logic. So Charles, earlier you said that through a priori reasonings, we deduce some truth, and that's true. So we're dealing with deduction. So this is an example of deductive logic, which I'm teaching for those interested in the fall. And this is a basic principle that we derived thousands of years ago from Aristotle, the principle of non-contradiction, but it's presented in symbolic mathematical language. So this says A and not A within parentheses, and then that's denied. So you can see how this negation symbol, the tilde, applies to the whole scope of what's included within those parentheses, denying this is possible. So A and not A. You can plug any English language sentence you want into A as a variable. So let's say A means I am standing. So then within the parentheses, that sentence would say, I am standing and I am not standing. That's a contradiction. It's impossible. It's impossible for me to even conceive of what it would be like for a being to be standing and not standing at the same time. Just like it's impossible for me to conceive of 2 + 2 = 7, right? So I cannot even imagine what that's like. So this is where he says, find it here. Yeah, so this is on page 12. And he says, all reasonings, hold on. Where the hell did it go? It's actually a little earlier on page 8, when he says, what never was seen or heard of may still be conceived. Right, so I've never seen a centaur, that is a being that has, the top half of a man and the bottom half of a horse, but I can conceive of it, right? So what never was seen or heard of may still be conceived. Nothing is beyond the power of thought except what implies an absolute contradiction. So it's not contradictory for me to think of a centaur because I have some experience with men, humans, I have some experience with horses, and then I just combine these ideas. But the absolute limit that constrains the very power of human thought is contradiction. So I can think of wild, fantastical beings. I can put forward my imagination into the most amazing sort of structures of possibility. But I cannot conceive of A and not A. I cannot conceive of standing and not standing. I cannot conceive that 2 + 2 = something other than 4. And then we have conceptual definitions. So, for example, bachelors are unmarried males. I cannot conceive of a bachelor who's not an unmarried male because that's just what the word means, right? And notice that if someone says, I'm a bachelor, I don't need to interview them. I don't need to find out if they're an unmarried male. I don't need to go out and ask so-called bachelors whether they're unmarried males, and I don't need to ask unmarried males whether they're bachelors. So I don't need experience. That's a truth by definition. So the truth that bachelors are unmarried males tells us something about ourselves more than it does about the outside world. It tells us that we divide the human population into genders. It tells us that we have an institution of marriage that we take seriously or find important. And so that has nothing to do with nature. That has nothing ultimately to do with reality, but those are relations of ideas, that is, associations of ideas that we have of reality on the basis of our experience. Here's where we get the difference between the analytically true and the synthetically true. So this is an example of an analytically true sentence. And this this is the example. Bachelors are unmarried males. Bachelors are unmarried males, that's an example of an analytic sentence. And what makes it analytically true? Well, we'll do a little grammar. So every grammatically correct sentence has a subject and a predicate. So what is the subject of this sentence? Anybody? Bachelors are unmarried males. What's the grammatical subject?
Would it be bachelors?
Yeah, bachelors. And then the predicate would be what? So the predicate is always something that is predicated of the subject.
Isn't it are?
Yeah, so the predicate is usually made up of the verb and the object, right? So it would be unmarried males. And so the are is doing the work. So what brings the subject and the predicate together is the verb. So the status of being both male and unmarried is predicated of the subject, of the bachelor. So looking at the relationship between subject and predicate here, what is that relationship? So how does the word bachelor relate to the predicate unmarried male? So compare or relate bachelor to unmarried male. How would you characterize or describe the relationship between those?
Or is it they are unmarried males?
Right, so then there is an absolute identity between the subject and the predicate. Bachelor just means unmarried male, right? So then the relationship between the subject and the predicate is analytic. To analyze something is literally to take what is a whole and to break it down into its parts, to see how they fit together. So then to understand what a bachelor is, you are simply, and this is what the sentence does, this particular sentence, it simply analyzes the subject. So the predicate is the product of analysis of the subject. You get this predicate by just breaking open the subject. So you crack open the subject bachelor, and what you get are unmarried and male. And this is why it's impossible, it's inconceivable that you would ever encounter a bachelor who is not unmarried or a male. It can't even be conceived of without a contradiction, because to the extent that you encounter an unmarried woman or a married man, then you're no longer dealing with a bachelor by definition, right? But take another sentence, the book is on the table. So what's the subject of that? The book is on the table.
The book?
The book. And what's the predicate? So what are we predicating? In other words, what are we describing the book, the subject here in terms of?
It's on.
Yeah, it's specifically on the table. So book is on the table. Yet, notice how different that is from this analytically true sentence. There is nothing conceptually about being on a table or tableness or anything like that that's necessarily related to the concept of book, right? Books could exist without ever being thought of in the same context as a table, right? They don't necessarily have anything to do with each other. So then if I want to verify that the book is on the table, just like I said with the coffee cup, I need to use my eyes my hands, and so forth to figure out where the book is, to verify that it's true, to confirm the truth of that sentence. Whereas when it comes to bachelors or unmarried males, I don't need to use my experience at all because it's a matter of definition. So to separate relations of ideas from matters of fact, when it comes to relations of ideas, the contrary can never be conceived of without contradiction, because that represents the hard limits of thought, conceivability. Whereas when it comes to matters of fact, such as the book is on the table, today is Thursday, I'm wearing hiking boots, my colleague is in her office down the hall. These are all matters of fact, which need to be verified through experience. And that means they can always turn out to be false, whatever assumptions I might make, right? So what does this tell us? What's the big upshot here? We are, for Hume, given that this is a comprehensive account of the generation and possibility of knowledge as such, we find ourselves then torn between, on the one hand, relations of ideas which are certain, a priori knowable, necessarily and analytically true, the contradiction of which cannot be conceived of without the contrary of which cannot be conceived of without contradiction. But however certain and necessary these truths are, they don't really tell us anything informative about the nature of the world, of what we call reality. They just tell us about how the ideas that we have about reality in the world relate to each other in different ways. And then there's matters of fact, on the other hand, which, unlike relations of ideas, do tell us informative things about the world. But they never tell us informative things about the world that we can have absolute confidence in terms of our knowledge of them. So they're always uncertain, given that they're always contingent and need to be verified at every instance by appeal to sense experience, or at least, Hume would suggest, experimental philosophy, which is a different way of saying something like the experimental method within the natural sciences, right? And that's sort of what we see the character in the Horla, in Guy de Maupassant's story, doing when he's trying to determine whether or not it's true that he's being menaced by this invisible being from another world. So he sets up various experimental conditions, like putting muslin cloth on his water bottle, or putting ash or something on the water bottle to see if he gets it on his hands or his mouth. So he's trying to use experimental conditions to arrive at a more or less true judgment, which will nevertheless be only contingently true about the reality that he's experiencing. Right? So does this make sense? I mean, we're moving really slowly through this because this can be complicated, and without a lot of participation, I don't exactly know when it's safe or a good idea to continue. So yeah, we're not really going to get through all of this. But here is another way to put this upshot. Relations of ideas. We're dealing with relations of ideas. Another way to put that in logic is a logical truth, a necessary truth. So for example, we can't imagine a case in which you have two cats. So I have two cats on the left here and 10 cats on the right. So I say on the left there are 2 cats, on the right there are 10. We can never conceive of a situation in which, although we recognize that there are 2 on the left and 10 on the right, that we think that there are more on the left than are on the right. The very fact that you note a higher quantity on the right is sufficient as a relation of idea to bring you to the conclusion that there are, in fact, more cats on the right than there are on the left. So you can know that those ideas are true because, like the notion of someone standing and not standing at the same time, you can't even conceive of the situation in which it's false, right? But when it comes to matters of fact, and here's a way to make sense of Hume's vocabulary, we can distinguish what he calls matters of fact from actual fact, or from fact simplicator. So a matter of fact would be some truth which is determinable as a potential fact, but it's not yet verified. So, for example, I don't yet know if my colleague, Dr. Chinjeri, is in his office. I don't know. But what turns out to be the case, if he's in his office or he's not in his office right now, that truth will be determined not as a relation of ideas, but as a matter of fact. But then after class, when I go knock on his door, and if he answers it, my assumption that my colleague is in his office, and that assumption I recognize as a matter of fact before I set myself forward to figure it out, to determine it, that will now be verified as a fact. So when we talk about matters of fact, knowledge of matters of fact, we're talking about what can be verified, or rather, more strongly, more accurately than that, what would have to be verified through sense experience. So then, in other words, we can call matters of fact possible facts that have not been confirmed, or in other words, have not yet been observed. So for example, all of us right now know, we seem to know that there are people living on the continent and country of Australia, even though, since none of us, or I don't know, maybe you are in Australia, I don't know. But even though we can't experience them, we seem to know that they're there. And we seem to know with confidence that the sun will rise tomorrow, even though we haven't, of course, experienced the future. We haven't experienced what happens tomorrow. So how do we know these things? And that's an important question. So how, let's use the latter example about the sun rising tomorrow. How is it that we can be sure that the sun will rise tomorrow? What kind of knowledge is that?
Experience.
So how does our experience tell us that, though?
We've only known that that thing that we're expecting to happen, so we have no reason to assume it wouldn't, I guess.
Yeah, good, exactly. That's a great way to put it. So this is what we call, within philosophy, within logic, also within the sciences, given that arguments are made to interpret scientific findings or the results of experiments. This is what we call inductive logic or inductive reasoning versus purely deductive logic or reasoning, which is a priori in character, that is knowable independently of experience. So when I claim to know that the sun will rise tomorrow, that's only because, as Shay pointed out, in the course of my individual experience, every morning has been in that way the same. The sun has come up every morning, every day of my life. And every day of the lives of those who lived before me, my parents and their parents and so forth, it too is marked by that communicable and shared experience. And all the way back in history, that has been true, right? So because some state of affairs has turned out to be correct so consistently, so without counterexample, in a virtually endless series of instances, I can rest assured with a high degree of confidence that it'll be true tomorrow. But it's important that we're clear, looking at relations of ideas versus matters of fact. Deductive logic is what dictates, in terms of logic itself, the truth of conclusions of deductive argumentation, arguments in natural deduction. But I can't deduce that the sun will come up tomorrow. And remember, what separates ultimately for Hume relations of ideas from matters of fact is when it comes to a truth I know by way of relations of ideas, the contrary of that truth is inconceivable. So again, I can't conceive of a bachelor who's not an unmarried male. I can't conceive of 2 + 2 not equaling 4. I can't conceive of someone standing and not standing at the same time. But since we arrive with confidence at the truth that the sun will come tomorrow, by definition, that fails the test of validity when it comes to deductive logic. We can't know deductively that the sun will rise tomorrow. And that means for Hume that it's no contradiction to suppose that the sun won't rise tomorrow. In fact, at some point, there will be a tomorrow in which the sun does not come up, right? The sun is not an immortal entity. It will someday supernova and end the life of our solar system as we know it, right? So you can never know with absolute a priori certainty as a necessary truth that the sun will rise tomorrow. But that doesn't mean that it's absurd to think that it will, because given the overwhelming preponderance of evidence of our past experience, we come to the conclusion that we take to be necessary that it will rise tomorrow. But the question Hume wants to pose is, how is it that we can have such a powerful degree of certainty or confidence when it comes to matters of fact? So these unobserved facts, not verified facts that are verified by my present experience, but unobserved facts. So it's clear that our sense experience justifies us in our beliefs regarding these observed phenomena, which we called facts. But how does this work when it comes to, in the order of our experiential lives, aspects that are presently withheld from our sensation? So imagine this, consider the scenario. You see a fire burning a building, say 300 yards away. Well, it's at this point too far for you to feel the sensation of heat. Yet, without any difficulty, without any real intellectual work, you arrive at the conclusion of which you're quite confident that if you were to go to that fire and stick your hand in it, it would burn you. So Hume isn't denying that we make this move, that we move from first some observation, and then we infer some truth about the world on the basis of that observation that, strictly speaking, we haven't experienced. So he doesn't deny that we do this all the time. In fact, we are determined to do this by our very nature, according to Hume. But his question then is how we do it. So he's trying to explain this strange phenomenon, how we move from 1 to 2. So how you can be confident that the fire will burn you if you were not, if you were to touch it. So how do we arrive at this truth? Well, remember what Hume says, all of our knowledge comes from relations of ideas or matters of fact, right? So could it be through relations of ideas that I determined that this fire would burn me if I were to touch it, even though I'm not touching it? What do you guys think about that? So just like bachelors are by definition unmarried males, can I know that the fire will burn me in a similar way by relations of ideas? What do you guys think? So remember, conclusions that we come to by relations of ideas, the opposite or contrary of that conclusion cannot even be conceived of without contradiction. Yet I can conceive of a world in which the sun does not rise tomorrow without contradicting myself. I can conceive of nobody living on the continent of Australia, right? Even though I'm pretty sure people are there right now, I can imagine that nobody is on the continent of Australia without contradicting myself. So similarly, I can conceive of a situation, I can imagine it, in which I come to what seems to be a fire visually. I put my hand in it and it feels cold. So I can, and this is an example Hume uses, I can imagine walking out of my house one day and seeing what appears to be snow falling, and then it touches me and feels hot. I can conceive of that happening. I would be very surprised, obviously, to say the least, just like in the case of my touching a fire and it feeling cold. But I can conceive of that happening. And Hume would say that I would immediately, in my reasoning, be constrained to start considering other causes for the surprising outcome of my experience. So I might think, well, it's not snow. Maybe it's ash. Maybe there's a fire or something like that, right? So then we can't know something like, this fire that I see burning right now 300 yards away will burn me if I were to touch it, by relations of ideas, because that would mean that the contrary, that the fire would not burn me, is a contradiction. But it's not a contradiction. I can imagine that. I can conceive of it. Okay. So we can't just do it deductively, because if we could, well, then it should be contradictory to imagine our past experience being the same, all things being equal, our experience of fire and so forth, but then the futural matter, a fact that we haven't yet experienced, coming out or appearing differently, sort of questioning, undermining, or contradicting our expectations. But we can imagine that happening, so it's not contradictory. And that's because when we're dealing with deductive argumentation or logic, it's impossible that the premises are true, but that the conclusion is false. So is everybody with me so far? All right. So, well, how do we justify it? Well, by appeal to cause and effect reasoning. So we think something like heat, what will burn my flesh, is the effect of fire as a cause. That means whenever I see fire or flame, I'm perceiving a cause which will necessarily generate the effect of heat and burning, right? Okay, so that's how we do it. All reasoning concerning matter of fact seem to be founded on the relation of cause and effect, just like when you're playing pool, when you want to get, say, if you want to get this green ball into the corner pocket, you will make a decision. You'll make a kind of tactic on the pool table in terms of where to aim the cue, which balls, intermediary balls you want to hit, such that they will, in a chain of reaction, cause the green ball to go where you want it to go, right? So whenever we're asked, well, why do you believe something about a matter of fact, so something that has not yet been observed, we cite knowledge of the cause. So for example, if you hear voices in a room next door that's dark, so you don't see any people there, you think there are people. If I ask you why, you say, oh, I heard voices. Voices are the effect of human beings as causes, which means there must be people in that room, right? But now the question is, how do we know causal relations? So I can be sure that the fire will burn me, and it's for my own well-being and need for self-preservation, that's a possibility for me, that I'm not just going to go run headlong into the fire. I know that because I know that there's a causal relation between flame and heat. But now, how do I know these causal relations? So how can I know that if I hit one ball, it'll make contact to another, producing a movement? Or how do I know that because there are voices, there are people? Well, it's not just, again, relations of ideas. So for example, and this comes from the textbook, and it's one of the questions for this week's discussion forum, Adam, the first human being, according to biblical scripture from Genesis, Adam, the first human being, if he were to see water for the very first time, he could not deduce just by the outward appearance of water that it would drown him if he were to dive into it, right? That is understood by human beings. Unfortunately, people have died because of this through experience, right? So you can't deduce just by looking at a rock that it's going to be magnetic. You need to expose it to metal, right? To see how it functions, to see how it works. In short, you need to appeal to deeper experience to come to these truths. So then, you cannot infer by causal relations, that is, using logic, deductive logic, these kinds of determinate truths, because any cause can be supposed to have a variously infinite variety of effects. So it's no contradiction when you're playing billiards, when you're playing pool, to think that if ball A strikes ball B, that an infinite number of things could happen. Ball B doesn't move. Maybe ball B flies into the air. Maybe ball B disappears into the table. Maybe it explodes. Maybe it turns into Kanye West. There's absolutely no way for you to put reason to work to arrive at that conclusion. That is, not using any background of your own experience and experiential familiarity with objects. So then maybe we know these things because of the laws of nature, such as Newtonian classical mechanics, right? So here's an example of Newton's second law of motion, which says if you apply 1 Newton, so 1 unit of force to a billiard ball, which is measurable as having a mass of 1 kilogram, it'll accelerate at 1 meter per second squared. So if you're equipped with this mathematical knowledge, maybe you can adopt a better strategy at the pool table. But we don't arrive at these laws themselves, these so-called laws of nature themselves, through relations of ideas, that is pure reasoning or pure logic. We only know them because of experience. And in fact, since the 18th century, through various experimental practices, we've determined that under certain conditions, these so-called laws of nature are not law-like. There are counterexamples. So then we learn them ultimately through experience, just like we learn everything else. So Hume argues then that there's nothing about our experience that justifies our conclusions about causal relations or even the laws of nature that we develop through our understanding over time of these causal relations. So does this make sense? Okay, so then there's a missing premise. And I wonder if you guys have a sense of what we are assuming or taking for granted to bring 1 together with 3. So this is, it might seem complicated based on what we've talked about so far, but it's pretty simple. So why is it that I think that just because I see this fire burning 300 yards away and I've been familiar with fire before, that this fire will burn me if I am to touch it? So what are we assuming about the world that makes it possible for us to rely with great confidence on our past experience?
I guess we assume that like all fire like acts the same and all fire burns us.
Right. So this is what Hume or scholars of Hume's epistemology here refer to as the principle of the uniformity of nature. So that sounds fancy, but it's really simple. It just means that all things being equal, what happens in our past tends to resemble the future and vice versa, right? So if fire has burned us in the past, there's no reason to suppose that it won't in the future. Okay, so we assume then that nature is uniform. So what happens in the past will happen in the future. But if we know that that's true, if we're not just assuming it, how do we know that it's true? So again, we're applying Hume's fork. Do we know the principle of the uniformity of nature from relations of ideas or from matters of fact? Those are the only possible options for us, right? But we've already seen that it cannot be from relations of ideas, because otherwise it would be inconceivable that we're surprised by future events that seem to defy our expectations. We would be surprised that the fire would be cold, but we're very often surprised in terms of our experience. It's not a contradiction to suppose the sun won't rise tomorrow. It's not a contradiction to suppose the fire will be cold. So do we do it through matters of fact? Well, I'm going to jump ahead here to Bertrand Russell. So he's a 20th century philosopher who said, just because, and this is his interpretation of Hume, just because past futures have tended to resemble past pasts, it doesn't follow that future futures will resemble future pasts, right? So we can't rely on our experience to tell us what the future is necessarily, because we have never experienced the future, right? And so here's a little graphic, and we're out of time now, that shows the problem. So this graphic depicts the problem of induction. So how do we know about matters of fact, or matters, as he says, of real existence? How do I know that the coffee will taste a certain way when I taste it, or that the fire will burn me when I touch it? Well, because of cause and effect. Okay, well, how do I know about cause and effect? Because of experience. From causes which appear similar, like flame, we expect similar effects, like burning or heat. Okay, but how do I know that I can rely on my experience? So how do I know that just because fire in my experience has burned, that fire, this particular fire that I have not yet experienced to the touch, will burn? Well, because I have this principle of the uniformity of nature, that the future tends to resemble the past. But now how do I know that? Well, it can't be through relations of ideas, because it's not contradictory to imagine the contrary. And if we suppose that it's through matters of fact, well, what has happened? We find ourselves in a pattern of circular reasoning, right? Which means we find ourselves in a pattern of unjustified reasoning. So however impossible it is for you to think that when you go to your car next time to go to the store, that it will not have transformed into a giant beetle or butterfly and flown away, your expectation that that's not the case is nothing rational. You have no rational justification to suppose that that's the way the world is. It's just a product of feeling because of your past experience with your car behaving in a more or less consistent and determinate manner. All right, so this has really powerful and profound implications for our everyday lives, for scientific reliability, and so forth. But we're out of time, and I hope it made some degree of sense. And we'll say a few more things about this next time before getting into the time travel material. But I'll finish up grading your papers by tomorrow, and have a good weekend. I'll see you guys next week.
Thank you. Have a good weekend.
Thank
Yeah.
you.